You've seen it all, right? The gleaming handshakes, those historic signings, the carefully crafted statements about unprecedented breakthroughs. That's the glossy cover story of Middle East peace efforts we usually get. But what if the real story, the one actually shaping the future of this incredibly volatile region, is unfolding way off camera, buried under layers of diplomatic speak? What if those tales of progress are conveniently skipping over fault lines that are actually getting wider, not smaller? We keep hearing peace is just over the horizon, but what if that horizon is just a mirage hiding a much more complicated and frankly dangerous reality? So let's forget the photo ops for a second. The hard truth? This whole quest for Middle East peace looks less like a friendly handshake and a lot more like a brutal high-stakes chess game where entire nations are the pieces, and losing is just unthinkable. For years now, especially since around 2020, the big story in Middle East peace has really centered on things like the Abraham Accords. You remember that's when the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all normalized ties with Israel. It was talked up as a total game changer. The official story, then and now, is all about growing cooperation in the region, better understanding between faiths, and everyone wanting to get richer together. We saw the smiling leaders, the new embassies popping up, direct flights between cities that once felt worlds apart. The promise seemed crystal clear, a new age of stability, all driven by common goals and leaving old fights behind. It was that whole peace to prosperity idea, where money and economic perks were supposed to be the magic wand, helping everyone sidestep those really thorny political problems. But here's the catch. That official story, as good as it sounds, is missing some huge pieces. Once you look past the headlines, you find this hidden world of intense power plays, huge strategic shifts, and visions for the future that are constantly clashing and really deciding where the region is headed. The truth is, these peace efforts aren't happening in some kind of bubble. They're under massive pressure from old wounds, countries whose power is growing or fading, and the quiet plans of nations both inside and outside the Middle East. Those smiles, for the camera, they often hide some pretty deep worries and strategic moves that you'll never read about in the official announcements. What they're not telling you is that the very basis of some of these peace deals is shaking, not because people don't want peace, but because of those awkward, messy realities of global politics. So let's start looking at what's really going on beneath the surface, beginning with the raw power struggles. Take the Abraham Accords. They weren't just about peace for its own sake. A big strategic aim for Israel was to try and shift the whole region's attention away from the Palestinian issue and instead build a united front against Iran. That was a very deliberate chess move designed to change what everyone was focusing on. But here's the thing, that vision is bumping up more and more against what other big players in the region want. Think about the changing relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. After years of really intense rivalry, China stepped in and brokered a deal in 2023 that saw them patch things up, a normalization of ties that seriously shook up the regional game board. This wasn't just a minor thaw between two countries, it was a sign that some were looking to move away from security setups in the Gulf that revolved only around the United States. We've seen high-level meetings keep happening into 2025 between Saudi and Iranian officials, even military folks, talking about regional security and working together. In April 2025, Saudi Arabia's defense minister actually visited Tehran and met with Iran's supreme leader. That's a pretty loud signal that their dialogue is getting serious. This evolving Saudi-Iranian connection really messes with the simple story of an Arab-Israeli bloc forming against Tehran. It looks more like some Gulf nations are playing a more independent game, spreading their bets and trying to de-escalate things directly with other powers in the region, instead of just banking on an anti-Iran alliance. Then you've got the growing influence of China. Beijing pulling off that mediation between Riyadh and Tehran. That was a diplomatic power move, showing just how much more sway it has in a region the United States used to largely dominate. China's not just showing up with bags of money anymore, it's acting like a serious diplomatic player. They're pushing their peace through development idea and offering different ways to think about regional security that don't always line up with what Washington wants. China has inked strategic partnerships with a bunch of Middle Eastern countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia included, focusing on money and tech, and they're even floating ideas like a China League of Arab States Data Security Cooperation Initiative. Now this isn't about China kicking the US out overnight, but it's definitely a challenge to that old idea of the US being the only major power calling the shots in the Middle East. And what about the United States? With the Trump administration back in office in January 2025, they've brought their own unique style. There's been a big push to reconnect with Gulf allies, including huge economic and defense deals. We're talking a $142 billion defense package with Saudi Arabia, and a commitment from the UAE to invest $1.4 trillion in the United States. At the same time, the Trump administration has said it would rather make a new deal with Iran than get into a military fight, a bit of a change from their old maximum pressure stance, possibly using sanctions now as a bargaining chip for new talks. There's also been chatter about expanding the Abraham Accords even more, with Syria being encouraged to join, after the United States announced it was lifting sanctions on the new Syrian government following the Assad regime's collapse in late 2024. All this complex maneuvering by the US, trying to build stronger alliances with some while also re-engaging with adversaries, just throws another layer of what happens next into the mix. Here's something else they're often not spelling out. There's no single agreed-upon roadmap for Middle East peace, not even close. Instead, what you have are these competing ideas, these different blueprints, all fighting for the top spot. The Abraham Accords, that's one model. It's backed by the US, includes Israel, and is mainly about keeping Iran in check while boosting economic ties. People who back it will point to how the existing deals have mostly held up, even with all the turmoil in the region like the Gaza war. The countries involved have largely stuck to their commitments because they see long-term upsides, like getting access to new tech and trade. That whole idea that focusing on money can calm down political fights, that's still a big driver. But that's not the only approach out there. Iran, feeling squeezed, has floated its own idea, the Muwada, or Muslim West Asian Dialogue Association. Now, unlike the Abrahamic model, which talks about including Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Muwada is specifically for Muslim nations, both Shia and Sunni, and it pointedly leaves Israel out on religious grounds. What's interesting is that Iran's plan even ropes in Turkey, a traditional rival, which suggests they're being pretty practical about building a different kind of regional group. And this Muwada idea, it starts to look a bit more appealing to some after something like the Gaza war, which really showed the limits of the other existing plans.
And that brings us straight to the massive, unmissable issue, the Palestinian question. A core problem, and a lot of people would say a fatal flaw, of the Abraham Accords was how it pushed the Palestinian cause to the side. Palestinian leaders saw this as a betrayal, and it seriously damaged how legitimate the Accords looked to huge numbers of people across the Arab world. The Accords were meant to shift the region's focus away from Palestine, but the 2023 to 2025 Gaza war has shoved it right back to the front and center of everyone's minds. The absolutely devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we're talking the entire population at critical risk of famine as of May 2025, and over 54,607 Palestinians reported killed by June 2025, has made it something no one can ignore. As of early June 2025, more than 640,000 people have been displaced again just since March 2025, and only 38% of health clinics and hospitals across Gaza are even partly working. The sheer amount of suffering, with aid deliveries described as way too little and dangerously unsafe, has just ramped up the pressure for a real, lasting solution that actually deals with Palestinian rights. The ceasefire talks that are going on, they're still incredibly tense. Hamas wants a permanent end to the fighting and a full Israeli pullout, while Israel is only talking about temporary pauses unless Hamas gives up its weapons. The situation for people on the ground is horrific, with reports of Palestinians being killed just trying to get food aid. This ongoing crisis really proves that any peace plan trying to ignore or downplay the Palestinian issue is just built on shaky foundations. In fact, some Arab leaders are now reportedly saying that any more normalization with Israel depends on seeing real steps towards a two-state solution and Palestine getting into the United Nations. So why should you care about all these hidden dynamics? The power games, the shifting teams, the different dreams, and the truths that get swept under the rug. Well, they matter because they completely change how we should think about what peace in the Middle East even looks like, and what the real chances of it happening are. If we ignore all this background noise, we end up with a picture that's way too simple, and honestly, dangerously so. Those big breakthroughs everyone celebrates, like the Abraham Accords, they're definitely important, no doubt about it. But they might not be the rock-solid foundations of a new regional order that some people paint them as. Trying to expand them has hit a wall, not because no one's trying, but because the whole idea of ignoring major regional problems and key players just isn't holding up. The Gaza war wasn't just a horrific humanitarian crisis, it was like a brutal stress test for who's aligned with whom. It showed that some of the government-to-government ties from the Accords are pretty tough, but it also exposed how deeply unpopular normalization is with ordinary people when their biggest complaints are still being ignored. And when you see other diplomatic efforts popping up, like China helping Saudi Arabia and Iran talk, it points to a future where Middle East security isn't just run by one superpower. It looks like regional countries are trying more and more to cool things down and manage their own problems, sometimes looking for security help beyond the usual Western powers. This doesn't mean the United States is suddenly out of the picture, but its traditional role as the one and only security blanket. Regional countries themselves are seriously rethinking that. On top of all that, the unresolved Palestinian issue just keeps stirring up instability. Trying to make peace deals that go over the heads of the Palestinians? That's a recipe for more anger and more conflict, not less. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza isn't just some isolated disaster. It's like a deep wound for the whole region. If it's just left to get worse, it'll keep wrecking any chances for a wider peace. United Nations officials and aid groups are constantly saying the conditions are beyond terrible, with aid blocked and kids starving. This isn't just a sad story, it directly changes the political math for every country in the area. This tug-of-war between a United States-led security setup and these newer, more locally driven, or even China-influenced ideas means that the road to stability is going to be a lot bumpier and more complicated than the official stories let on. The future probably isn't a smooth path to some perfectly agreed-upon peace. It's more likely to be a constant, messy negotiation between all these competing visions and power players. Getting your head around this complexity is so important, because any policies built on a cleaned-up or incomplete version of what's really happening are just set up to fail, and could make things even more unstable, not less. So if you're finding this kind of breakdown useful, think about subscribing so you don't miss out on more deep dives into these tricky global issues. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What unspoken truths do you think are most vital for really getting what's going on in the Middle East today? So, where does all this leave us? Is genuine peace in the Middle East just a pipe dream? Not necessarily. But the answer isn't some simple magic bullet peace plan or another big ceremony with everyone signing documents. The real solution, if you can call it that, especially for those of us just trying to make sense of the region, is to look at it with fresh eyes. We need a perspective that really takes in all the messy details, the hidden plans, and the competing goals that are actually steering things. You know how official stories tend to give you that smooth, almost cleaned-up version of what's happening? They shine a spotlight on the good news, the breakthroughs, the handshakes. And yeah, those moments can matter, but they're just one small piece of a much bigger, more complicated puzzle. To really get a handle on the challenges and also the genuine chances for peace, we've got to look past those carefully staged pictures. It's vital to get that the Abraham Accords, for instance, even though they've built new economic and diplomatic bridges for the countries involved, are sitting right in the middle of a landscape full of unresolved, deep-seated conflicts and shifting power plays. Whether they succeed and grow isn't a sure thing. It depends massively on things like how the United States deals with Iran, where the Saudi-Iranian relationship goes, and, this is huge, whether there's any real movement on the Palestinian issue. And the growing part China is playing? That's not just some minor detail, it's a major shift. It tells us we're moving towards a Middle East with multiple power centers, where countries in the region have more choices and are building a wider range of partnerships. This opens up new doors for diplomacy, but it can also create new sparks. The humanitarian and political disaster in Gaza isn't a side issue. It's a central, constant roadblock to any wider stability in the region. Any plan that says it's building lasting peace but ignores or downplays this deep wound is, frankly, either incredibly naive or, even worse, trying to pull the wool over our eyes. Those calls for a two-state solution, for Palestinians to decide their own political future, they aren't just empty words. For a lot of people, they're the absolute foundation for any peace that's going to be fair and, because of that, actually last. At the end of the day, what they're often not telling you is that there are no simple fixes here, and no straightforward good guys and bad guys. The path to peace in the Middle East is like this incredibly complex dance of national ambitions, old grudges, economic hopes, and sheer power. When progress happens, it's usually slow, easily broken, and can even go backwards. Setbacks? They happen all the time. So, no, the search for peace in the Middle East isn't some easy road paved with good intentions and smiling diplomats. It's more like a rugged landscape, full of hidden power battles, strategic shifts that are hard to pin down, and competing ideas about the future that don't often get talked about openly. Things like the Abraham Accords? Yes, they've opened some new doors, but they've also shone a bright light on just how incredibly complex and limited any peace effort will be if it doesn't tackle the whole range of regional complaints, especially that still unresolved Palestinian question. The Gaza war between 2023 and 2025 served as a harsh wake-up call, showing just how fast simmering tensions can boil over and how tied together everyone's fate in the region really is. It laid bare a lot of weaknesses, made everyone rethink their priorities, and really hammered home the urgent need for peace efforts that are more inclusive, more complete. Efforts that aren't afraid to face the hard truths. As outside powers like China adjust their roles, and as regional players like Saudi Arabia and Iran try to manage their own delicate warming of relations, the old ways of doing things are constantly being questioned. Figuring out what they're not telling you, that's really the first step to getting a more realistic and clued-in view. It helps us see past all the talk and truly appreciate the huge challenges, but also the real, even if complicated, paths that might one day lead to a Middle East that's more stable and fair for everyone. The real story is always more tangled, and somewhere in all that complexity, that's where you'll find something that looks a lot like the truth. What are your thoughts on where Middle East peace is headed? I'd genuinely like to hear your take in the comments below. And hey, if you found this useful, a like would be great, and make sure to subscribe for more content that tries to get beyond the headlines.